welcome to this first lecture of literary criticism and theory. I am Dr. Fouzi Slisli and I will be your instructor for this session. This first lecture is called The Stories Behind the Stories. It is divided in two lectures. We will look at the first part of this lecture, the stories behind the stories, and the second lecture will be called The Stories Behind the Stories number 2. So for this number 1 lecture, we will look at the relationship of Greece and Rome, and for the second lecture we will look at the relationship of Greece and Rome to Europe. Basically, here is what we want to do. We cannot understand the development of literature or literary criticism without understanding the relationship of Europe to classical antiquity. Classical antiquity is simply the word we use to refer to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. They're called classical antiquity, they're called the classics, they're called the ancients. Any of these three words are usually used to refer to the Greeks or the Romans. Of course, the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. So this relationship is complex and it's not easy to understand. To simplify it, we're going to try to take two segments. We want to understand the relationship of Greece to Rome, that's one, and in the second lecture we will try to understand the relationship of Greece and Rome to Europe. So I hope you will enjoy this. Literature basically, and literary criticism in Western culture, cannot be understood without its relationship to classical antiquity, Greece and Rome. You want to ask why? Why can't we understand it without reference to classical antiquity? Well, simply because European and Western literature and cultures were produced as a recreation, as a revival of the classical cultures of Greece and Rome. European literature and European criticism from the early modern period in the 16th century to the early 20th century. During all this time, European literature is an attempt to recreate, to reproduce the classical culture of Greece and Rome. And from the 16th to the 20th century, Western cultures considered Greece and Rome the most perfect civilizations. And Western drama, Western poetry, literary criticism, art, education, politics, fashion, education, painting, sculpture, everything were all produced in imitation of classical antiquity, in imitation of Greece and Rome. But this relationship, the West's relationship to Greece and Rome, the West's relationship to classical antiquity, is not very simple. It's full of contradictions and it's full of ambivalence. In these two lectures, this one and the one that's coming, as I said, we will look at, we will try to illustrate two aspects of this contradiction, this ambivalent relationship. We will look at Rome's ambivalent relationship to Greece. This is lecture 1. And we will look at the West's, Europe and the West's relationship to classical antiquity. This is lecture number 2. To explain the relationship of Rome to Greece, perhaps no other poet or writer put it so vividly like the poet Horace did in a line from a famous poet, from a famous poem that he wrote to the Emperor Augustus. It's called A Letter to Augustus. It's a famous poem. Horace wrote it for the Emperor Augustus, and in it there is a line that became very famous and became repeated throughout European history. In this line, Horace says, "Captive Greece took its wild conqueror captive." Captive Greece took its wild conqueror captive. Horace here expresses a sense of inferiority and an ambivalence. There is some sadness, there is some contradiction, there is some ambivalence in this line. Because Rome conquered Greece politically and militarily. Greece was a small little province in the huge big empire that Rome had. But although Rome was powerful militarily and politically, Greece, this little province, remained more sophisticated culturally. Greece had more books, more poetry, more tragedies, more literature, and Rome could never match that. So the Romans felt that they were first when it came to conquests, empire building, political power, but as far as culture, they always felt that they came second. They weren't as good as that little province that they controlled and governed called Greece. We find, so this is why Horace says, captive Greece, Greece was conquered by Rome, so Greece, captive Greece, took its wild conqueror, meaning Rome, captive. So Rome captured Greece militarily and politically, but Greece managed to conquer Rome culturally through its ideas, through its culture. And we find this sense of resentment, really. Roman poets express a sense of resentment that they can't come first in culture and literature and knowledge, just like they come first in politics and military and empire building. So there is this sense of resentment that we see here in Horace. And we find this sense of resentment not just in Horace, we find it everywhere in Latin literature. We find it in Horace, we find it in Quintilian, we find it in Seneca, we find it even in Cicero, we find it in Longinus, and so on and so forth. Seneca, for example, famously said, "No past life has been lived to lend us glory, and that which has existed before us is not ours." Essentially, he means that we don't have a past that's glorious, that we can be proud of today. No past life has been lived to lend us glory, to give us glory. We haven't lived a glorious history in the past that we can be proud of. No past life has been lived to lend us glory. And that which has existed before us, the glorious past that has existed before us, is not ours. It's the Greeks, right? So, as you can see, there is a sense of resentment there, that we don't have a glorious past, and the glorious past that's there isn't ours. Another perfect example from Seneca also, the poet and playwright Seneca, that also expresses this sense of ambivalence and resentment to the culture of ancient Greece, is another line from Seneca. He says, "A man who follows another," a man who follows another, of course he's talking about Rome having to follow Greece when it comes to culture. Rome was the leader in politics, in military, in empire building, but when it came to culture, to art, to literature, Rome had to follow Greece. Greece was leading. So Seneca says, a man who follows another not only finds nothing, he is not even looking. He is not even looking in front of him. So meaning that Rome is following Greece, and because Rome is following Greece, it won't find anything, because the Greeks have already found everything. But Rome is not even looking, because it's following Greece. For centuries, this situation created a lot of contradictions in Roman culture. The Roman culture that developed was contradictory. On the one hand, Rome wants to be the biggest empire, the biggest culture, the biggest place for learning and education, but on the other hand, Rome constantly found itself second, a poor second, to the great culture of this small province, Greece. So for centuries, education in Rome consisted simply in imitating Greek masterpieces. When you look at the educational programs in ancient Rome, most of them had curricula that simply were based on imitating Greeks. They imitated the Greeks in literature, in rhetoric, in painting, in mathematics, in everything. They imitated the Greeks. So the books that were produced, the manuals that were produced for poets, for rhetoricians, for painters, for artists, all of them instructed the poets, the Roman poets, to simply imitate the Greeks, to simply walk in the footsteps of the Greeks, because the Greeks established the model, the exemplar, what the Romans called the exemplar. And as long as the Romans couldn't produce their own models, their own exemplar, then they had to follow the exemplar, the models that were already established by the Greeks. It's only towards the 1st century AD, the 1st century BCE, and the 1st century at the time of Cicero, and the time of the late Republic and early Roman Empire, the time of Augustus, Emperor Augustus, that we find Roman literature producing its own models. So we find the poetry of Virgil. Virgil writes his famous Aeneid, which compares to Homer's, the Greek poet Homer's Iliad. We find poets like Horace and so on. It's only at this time that the Romans managed to create their own models and their own exemplar. But even those Roman models, they simply wanted to imitate the great masterpieces of the Greeks. An excellent example about this cultural attitude of following the Greeks that was dominant in Roman culture is provided for us by a poem by Horace. It comes from the same poem that I cited earlier on. It's a letter to Augustus, to the Emperor Augustus, and it's simply called Letter to Augustus. This is the poem where he says, "Captive Greece took its wild conqueror captive." In that same poet, Horace says the following. These are basically advices. These are advice he gives to aspirant writers, the youth in Rome who want to become writers, who are in school, in education, working to become writers and authors themselves, and orators and playwrights and poets and so on. So this is his advice to these young poets. And it gives you an idea, it gives you a sense of how education was organized, how literature was produced in Rome, part of this education program, how education was organized, and how literature in this program of education emerged and developed. So Horace says, "But he that hopes to have new words aloud must so derive them from the Grecian spring." Meaning, he that hopes, if one of you guys, you writers out there, if you hope to have new words aloud in your dictionary, in your vocabulary, in your plays, your poems, you must derive them from the Grecian spring. But he that hopes to have new words aloud must so derive them from the Grecian spring, as they may seem to flow without constraint. Because in this Grecian spring, in this Greek culture, from these Greek books, these wonderful new words seem to flow without constraints, without limits. These Greeks seem to have so many words. They have no shortage of new technical, scientific words. We don't have enough in our culture, in our Latin culture. So if you want to borrow words, make sure you borrow them from the Greeks. He continues, he says, new subjects are not easily explained. They're difficult. New subjects in literature, in art, in criticism, they're difficult, they're not easy to explain. And you had better choose a well-known theme. It's better if you just choose a well-known theme. What are the well-known themes at the time? They're the themes that come to the Romans from Greek literature. They're the themes that come from the Greek poet Homer, from the Greek orators, from the tragedians, from the comedians. These are the themes that are available, that most educated Romans are familiar with and read about them and know them and discuss them, and you know, hold meetings and use in their education and in their curricula. So Horace says, new subjects are not easily explained, and you had better choose a well-known theme than trust to an invention of your own. Don't trust your own invention. Just pick up one of these well-known themes. For what originally others write, he says, what others write and look so original, what the Greeks write so originally, right? He says, so what, for what others, or for what originally others write, may be so well disguised and so improved, that with some justice it may pass for yours. But then you must not copy trivial things, nor words for word too faithfully translate. Essentially what Horace is saying is that if you want to use new words, borrow them from the Greeks. If you want to introduce new topics, pick them up from the topics and the themes that are known in Greek books. Because what others write so originally, like the Greeks did, you can disguise it a little bit and change it a little bit and translate it into Latin, and you can pass it as if it's yours. But he says, but then you must not copy trivial things. Don't just copy everything you find in Greek literature and Greek poetry and Greek plays. And do not translate word for word. Change a little bit. Do some changes to make it look like it's yours. Of course, you can see here that the Romans so desperately wanted to imitate the Greeks and so constantly failed to match them, right? As you can see from the poem we just read. The question is, how can Roman poets imitate the Greeks? Just take their words, borrow their themes, and just disguise them a little bit and make them pass as if they are theirs. It's impossible. It'll be clear to those who know, sooner or later, it'll be clear that this culture that's being produced, this literature that's being produced, is imitative. It's plagiaristic, right? So the Romans so desperately wanted to imitate the Greeks and so constantly failed to match them. They failed because they couldn't be original. A man who follows another not only finds nothing, as Seneca says, he is not even looking. So the reason is very simple. Imitation cannot produce originality. If you just imitate, you will not be original. As Seneca was very smart to understand, a man who follows another not only finds nothing, he is not even looking. The Romans essentially were a simple, rural and uncultured people who became successful as warriors, right? And they built a huge, big empire. But at the height of their success, when they used to rule the biggest empire in the world, they still felt that they were inferior culturally to their small province Greece. And this situation strongly affected how culture was produced in Rome, and it will also affect how culture will be produced later on in Europe, because the Europeans later on, as we will see in the next lecture, the Europeans followed the Romans as a model. The Europeans said, well, we need, if we want to develop a culture of our own, if we want to develop a sophisticated language of our own, we need to do like the Romans did in imitating the Greeks. We need to follow the Romans model, and the Romans model is to imitate the classics, to imitate the ancients. And this is how European literature emerged. First, to develop European languages, to create the languages that we know today, French, English, German, and so on. And to do that, the Europeans followed the Roman model. And in the same way that the Romans found themselves in complications by simply imitating, when they simply imitated, later on they found that imitation has its own complications. The Europeans also will find that imitation leads to complications. This will be the topic of our next lecture. Thank you so much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.